off of LC 440333S. And I think this has gone through the appropriate sub and looks good, smells good. So go ahead, Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr.
Welcome.
Chairman. And we are operating off the correct LLC. But I'm here to come before you to present the substitute for House Bill 257. The Department of Community Affairs has been asked by various groups like ACCG and GMA to streamline the reporting requirements for all the authorities. And if you're not familiar with local government authorities, although I think most of you are, that could be, you know, downtown development, hospital, housing, development authorities. So currently they all have to submit 2 reports on an annual basis to DCA. One is the authority registration, and the current statute requires registration on or before January the 1st of each year. The second report is the report of registered authority finance, and states in the current statute that financial reports are due within 180 days of the end of the authority's fiscal year to correspond with the completion of the authority's audit. So this bill would allow the authority registration due date to mirror the financial reporting due date, because it just wouldn't make practical sense for the financial report to be due by January the 1st. So moving all the financial reports to the January 1st due date would mean that those communities that close their books on December the 31st wouldn't report their finances until up to 12 months or even longer than that. So that's a very long lag time. With these reports being consolidated into one, it's recommended that failure to complete the proposed authority registration and financial report would result in the authority being ineligible to incur debt or credit obligations, as well as being ineligible to receive state funds. Failure to comply will have no adverse effect on any outstanding debt or credit obligation of any local government authority or local independent authority. So I would ask for your favorable consideration of the substitute for House Bill 257.
All right, thank you so much. Any questions from members of the committee? Well, great. Then the chair will entertain a motion.
Do pass.
Got a motion to pass. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, like sign.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members.
Thank you. Is Chairwoman Ballinger here? No. All right. We're going to move on then to House Bill 268. And I believe Representative Fleming will be doing the honors in this one.
You want me to present from here or go down?
Whatever you feel comfortable with.
I'll just present from here.
Present from here is great. House Bill 268, Representative Fleming.
68 is an election law bill. The large majority of the bill is very similar, or actually exactly, a bill that was passed unanimously through the House in the 15th session by then Representative Mark Hamilton. That passed unanimously in the House, went over to the Senate, passed unanimously out of Senate committee, but got hung up in Senate rules. What I would like to do, Mr. Chairman, there are some new subsections there, and I was going to take the committee through those first and then come back and deal with the sections that were in there previously, and of course take any questions as the chairman sees fit. Mr. Chairman, the new sections in the bill start with Section 1. Section 1 is simply a change in the law which will require election officials who are our poll workers and whatnot, poll managers, to get training within 6 months of their appointment. Right now it's a year, so you could be appointed in January and go through an election cycle with never receiving your training. It also allows the State Board of Elections, if they're having problems with a particular elections office, to request and require that they get some additional training. Just like our city and county governments have continuing education training, so do the Board of Election members as well. Mr. Chairman, I'll move on to Section 2. Section 2 is also a new section to the bill. Section 2 really makes no substantive changes in the law at all. It simply rewrites and puts into, for lack of better description, better English, understandable how we go and qualify. That's all that does. Section 3 in the bill, when our primaries, this deals with when independents qualify. When our primaries were moved from July till May a few years back, one of the oversights was we did not change the qualifying time for independents. All this does is make the law like it used to be, where the independents qualify pretty much the same time as Democrats and Republicans do. That's what Section 3 does in the bill. I'll skip over, Mr. Chairman, to continue with the new sections to Section 8 in your bill. And I'm actually want to make sure that I'm working off an original copy rather than the sub, so I want to make sure they line up. Page 9, is that right, Mr. Chairman? Section 8 in the bill, this deals with voter registration in the state. Right now, under current law, if someone goes to register to vote and they put inappropriate, wrong information on a voter registration application, or they, for instance, put a nickname on there. Let's say your name is George Harden and you go by Buddy Harden, for example. You walk in there, you put down Buddy, and when that comes into our people who check these things by law with Social Security Administration and also driver services, Buddy doesn't show up, but somebody named George does. Right now, under Georgia law, a letter is generated to Buddy Harden, and it says, look, we've got down a George at this address. Are you the same person? Let us know so we can get this straight. If that person does not respond, then that voter registration is kicked out. What this does is changes that 30-day period to a much longer 26-month period. And the purpose behind that is to get you through another federal election cycle. Over a 2-year period, you're going to have a federal election cycle because we have them every 2 years. That allows Buddy to go into the polls. With technology now, the poll workers can usually correct the problems with his registration right there on the spot. And if for some reason they cannot, then Buddy is allowed to vote on a provisional ballot. That way, that gives the poll workers more than that's just that moment, about 3 days to check and try to get that right. And then they, of course, will count the vote if the person is properly registered. Mr. Chairman, the next new section in the bill is Section 13, and that's on page 13, I believe. Section 13 simply says that if a Board of Election is going to move a precinct, then they have to do that within 90 days of the election, so there's plenty of time for everybody to know where they will be voting. This actually was brought to our attention in a special election for a House seat, and the special election, the county, although it was a multi-county district, decided, the main county, the biggest county, decided they would only open one precinct because they have the ability to do that. Well, if you've got folks voting in 8 different precincts in every election, probably should do the same for that special election, unless you're going to do the 90 days notice and give everybody plenty of advance notice, and that's the changes that makes there. Mr. Chairman, next what I'll do is I'll go through the existing parts of the previous bill that I mentioned that was passed unanimously through the House and outline those. That begins with Section 4 on page 6. It may be a little surprising, but if someone writes in your name, you can be elected. Well, this simply changes that you have to consent to be elected to an office. It also probably causes a lot less problems of having to count a lot of write-in votes and certify them for people that could not even possibly be elected. That's all Section 4 does. And like I said, Mr. Chairman, everything I'm about to go through has already been approved unanimously by the House in the 15 bill I mentioned. Now, Section 5 of the bill, and all this is going to be identical to some changes that we're going to make in Section 6, 9, 10, and 14. All it does is remove an antiquated term of municipal registrars from our code. We no longer have municipal registrars in our code. We used to, but now we have county registrars. All it does is remove that term that we don't even use anymore. That's Section 5, 6, 9, 10, and 14. Section 6, as I just mentioned, does that, so let's go over to Section 7 in the bill. Section 7 in the bill removes an ID that we do not use in the state of Georgia. That is a Bureau of Indian Affairs card. Now, you may ask, why in the world does our law have to begin with a Bureau of Indian Affairs card? It was simply because when we had our voter ID law in Georgia, the Arizona law, back then you had to have pre-clearance for such thing, had already been pre-cleared by the Justice Department. We simply lifted that exact language, stuck it in our code. In Arizona, they do have Bureau of Indian Affairs cards. We don't have reservations as such in Georgia, so we're simply removing that, something that's not used from our code section. Next, that takes us, Mr. Chairman, over to Section 9 of the bill, because I already went over Section 8. Section 9 is another removal of the word municipal registrar, as I already mentioned. Same thing with Section 10. Section 11 of the bill, Mr. Chairman, on page 12, all Section 11 does is strike language that we're fixing to add and correct down in Section 12. So let me move to Section 12. Section 12 makes it clear that when you move from one county to another, the county that sends you your new voting information is the county you move to. Sounds logical, sounds reasonable, but that's not clearly what our law says, and that's all that does. Once again, that was in the bill from 15. Section 13 I've already covered. Section 14 is another one of those, simply striking the word municipal registrar, because we don't have that anymore in the state of Georgia. Section 15 of the bill on page 14, I believe. Get my notes right here, Mr. Chairman. Oh, Section 15 of the bill, what that section does, it simply makes it clear, in a presidential primary year, if you go in as an absentee voter and ask for that ballot, now you get sent one for every other election. This makes it clear into the law when we have those presidential preference primary, that always comes on a special date, sometime a moving date, but when you ask for that, just like if you had waited to the primary and asked the regular primary and asked for an absentee ballot, if you ask for one in the presidential ballot, they'll continue to send you one for each election that year. Simply clarifies that. On down in Section 15, there's one other change starting with subsection B, and I've got it in my older copy on line 474. Let me double check and make sure. It's 475 now. On line 475, when you go in to vote, as we all know during early voting, you vote on the voting machine, the DRE as they call it. You do not vote by absentee ballot. If you go in before the 3-week early voting period votes, you vote on an absentee ballot at that point when you early vote. This simply makes it clear that that is exactly what we do in Georgia, and you don't come in during the 3-week period and request an absentee ballot. You go vote on the machine when you vote in person. Section 16 of the bill, right below that. Let me get my notes, Mr. Chairman. Yes. Right now, if you'll look there on what probably is about line 507 maybe, on the new one. I'm talking about a date of birth issue. Right now, we have to put your date, 505. Right now, you have to put your date of birth on the outside of the envelope. We're going to change that. That's, as you can imagine, for security reasons, not the best thing to do in this day and time. So it makes that one change right there. Now, the other part of that bill, if you turn over to the other part of that bill, well, I think that's the main part of what that does in section right there. Let me move on to Section 17 of the bill, which is on my page 16. Section 17 of the bill. When we moved to that federal compliance with our primary runoffs. That's the main reason we had to move our primaries a couple of years back. Some people wondered if it was clear that during runoffs for state candidates, you didn't have to have Saturday voting. We never have had that in the state of Georgia. This just makes it clear that that is the case, and it simply strikes that one word runoff, and I believe it's either on page 550 or 551 of your bill there. Moving on to Section 18 of the bill, You would also think it would be common sense that the poll manager in a polling precinct has the authority to say yes or no as far as how many people can be coming in the lobby, for example, to vote. But there have been instances where that was not clear, and this simply makes it clear that the poll manager is in charge of the polling precinct, and if somebody doesn't think so, they do have to answer to that person for the management of the polling precinct. Section 19 of the bill, the last part of the bill, simply makes it clear that if you go in and ask for a provisional ballot for whatever reason, you do in fact live in that county. You're making a good faith statement that, hey, I do live here in Fulton County and I'd like a provisional ballot. They actually have instances apparently where somebody will come in from a different county. They know they don't live there. They admit they don't live there, but we want to make it clear under Georgia law, if you're going to ask for a provisional ballot, you're saying to us up front you actually do live here. Mr. Chairman, that is, in summary, the bill. It passed after an hour-long, much closer examination in subcommittee previously unanimously, and I would ask for favorable consideration. Of course, be happy to answer any questions from the members.
Thank you so much, Representative Fleming, and I do understand that Chairman Powell vetted it thoroughly yesterday, but we do have some questions. We'll start with Representative Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I was at the markup yesterday, and I think we did a very thorough job. One thing I didn't notice, in line 489, the underlined for voting purposes, is that a legal definition? I mean, I presume we're trying to avoid somebody voting at multiple places, which I'm sure is covered elsewhere as well, but what is the purpose of adding those words?
Did you say on line 49? I may have missed
Sorry,
it.
489.
489. Let me flip over there, 489. Line 489. I think that's just a clarification of the language, yes. I mean, that doesn't have any substantive change. It would seem to be obvious that that's why you were there voting, but that's
But that doesn't have any
clarification.
meat as far as
To my knowledge,
additionally
to my
preventing
knowledge,
someone
it does not. Mr. Chairman, I did bring with me today smart people. Ryan Germany out there with the Secretary of State's office, their top attorney, and if the chair would allow, he may have a better answer to that. I'm not sure.
That's great.
Did you understand the question, Mr. Germany?
First person today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To answer Representative Price's question very briefly, on line 489, that deals with the oath people sign on the absentee envelope when you turn it in. We had instances where people were putting the location where they actually were voting their absentee ballot. For instance, if you're in college in Clark County, they were putting Clark County on there instead of where they're actually registered to vote, Hall County or wherever. So this just tries to clarify the county we need listed on there is where you're registered to vote, not where you physically are.
All right, thank you so much. Number 20, Representative Oliver.
I don't remember the bill from 2015, and I wasn't in the subcommittee, so forgive me for going back and focusing on Section 8, which is new.
Yes, ma'am.
Is this bill the Secretary of State's requested bill?
Well, not all of it. I mean, parts of it came from the example like I gave you with the state legislator. The independent qualifying date was not. A lot of that stuff out of that cleanup bill was.
Section 8, is that requested by the Secretary of State?
Section 8, I'm not sure if they requested it. It was something that I was aware of that needed to be addressed, but it's there.
Would you go through that a little bit more slowly? I'm trying
Sure.
to figure out what the purpose is of this.
Sure. Right now, this deals with the voter registration process.
Right.
And right now in Georgia, if Mary Margaret Oliver goes in to register to vote in DeKalb County, and you write down Beth Oliver, I'm trying to think of a good nickname for you, Representative. You write down Beth Oliver because that's what all your family calls you. We are required by federal law in Georgia to match whatever you put down to our driver services and our Social Security Administration.
May I interrupt you? And
Please.
Forgive me. I'm looking at 8351 ERS, and beginning on line 304, we're talking about driver's licenses
Mhm.
or Social Security numbers. And
Right.
so
That's correct.
Okay, go ahead, I'm sorry.
So when you go in, you are required to check driver services for things like driver's license numbers, because that's how federal law requires us to check with Social Security records and driver's records.
Requires me to check or requires Secretary of State to check?
Requires the person that you're registering to vote with. That would, this case would be the county registrar or the Secretary of State. So when you register to vote, those two checks are required. But if somebody put down Beth Oliver, not Mary Margaret Oliver, and those other two sets of records from Social Security Administration and Driver Services said Mary Margaret, you would automatically, under our current state law, be generated a letter saying, hey, Beth, is this you? Are these the same people? And you now have 30 days to respond to get that straightened out. And when you respond, they'll confirm that you are who you say you are, you're registered to vote, you're ready to go. Now, what this bill does, it's going to change that to a much longer period of time, 26 months. If you look over online, Buzz, is it 363 or 362? 362. You see that term 26 months right there?
Right.
That is the operative change in this section right here. So instead of having just the 30 days to respond, you now have 26 months. The rationale behind the 26 months is this. If a person actually, if Beth Oliver came to vote in the polls and she for some reason did not respond to that prior letter she got, this gets you through at least one more federal election cycle, allows that over 2 year period to elapse. When you come in now, it's very likely that they can fix the problem in today's computer age. They can fix it right there in the polls, and you can go ahead and vote. If for any reason they cannot fix the problem like they would have done had you responded earlier, you will be allowed under this new code section to vote a provisional ballot, and of course that gives a few days to get it straightened out, and that ballot can be counted. That's the change. It's the 26 months to the 30 days.
Obviously, for the person who doesn't have a driver's license, doesn't have a Social Security number, none of this is relevant. They come in with
it wouldn't show up, I guess, if you didn't have either one of those.
So,
but we have a voter ID law in Georgia, and I believe they could check it. A voter ID that can be given in Georgia, and that could be checked also.
Right. So we're not talking about people just walking in with the voter ID that the state issues. We're talking only about driver's license and Social Security number people.
I believe that is the case, yes.
So the mechanics is Beth Oliver comes in and says she's Beth Oliver.
Right.
And has a ID that says Mary Margaret Oliver. She's given a provisional license, and then 26 months. When does the provisional license
No. Here's what would happen in that situation. You walk. I say in your scenario, you've walked into the polls to vote. The Beth Oliver that registered to vote 12 months earlier, for example, who didn't respond to the initial attempt of communicating with you, that would pop up when they check for who you are by who you say you are.
You're in the 26 months.
You're in the system at that point. They say, oh, are you Mary Margaret Oliver who lives at this address? And at that point, you probably do get a driver's license, and you show them, oh, that's who I am. There's a process to go through. I am told that they'll very likely be able to fix the problem right then and there. If for any reason they can't, they'll then, under this new law, give you a provisional ballot.
Still be allowed to vote.
Still be allowed to vote, and then they've got days instead of minutes to straighten it out and count that vote if you're properly registered.
Thank you.
And there's nothing in here about the time of early voting, and there's no intent from the Secretary of State to do any amendments on time of early voting on this.
I don't believe there's anything in here about the time of early voting. The only thing about that early voting is what I mentioned, where you go in.
Right.
If you're within the 3 weeks, you vote on the machine. If you're outside of it, it's an early absentee ballot. Clarifies that.
I don't know if anybody could speak for the Secretary of State. As for this committee, unless they choose to do so. Okay. There is discussions on uniformity, as you know, but has nothing to do with this particular piece of legislation. Number 27, who's lit up over there?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Question I have is about lines 573 through 575, this management of persons in the polling location.
Yes.
And the question I want to ask is about the inclusion of law enforcement officers. What's the rationale?
Well, a law enforcement officer, if he is required to come into a place, always has the authority to keep the peace. And so I would think that we want to make it clear that that's the case here. There have been instances, unfortunately, where I think law enforcement officers have been required to come to the polls, and we don't want to, by our law, make any claim that they can't go into a place where they're needed.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask a further question.
Please.
Does the gentleman have any concern about local elections, that this might authorize people to be in a polling location under this provision that shouldn't be there when their name is on the ballot?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
So certain of our law enforcement officials are elected officials.
Correct.
Does this language give them an opportunity to be in a polling location and not have the polling officer be able to tell them that they can't be there?
Well, I think where you are now is that you'd have, I think the only local elected official would be a sheriff or a marshal. It would be a law enforcement officer. And marshals are not in most counties. It happens to be in the one next door to me. But let's use a sheriff, for example. He is allowed to go vote, obviously. He can go to the polls and vote. He also probably, if there is a situation there, I know his deputies can come in, and probably if he needs to be there, he should be there. Now, there's also laws, as you and I both know, that does not allow you and I as candidates to go campaign in the polling places. So you've got two statutes that are going to have to be construed. And if we had a sheriff that was going into a polling place and saying, I am here, I think our poll, in their campaigning actually, our poll manager, their job is to say, I'm sorry, Sheriff, you can't campaign here according to X, Y, and Z code section. And if he pulls out this code section and says, I'm allowed to be here for this reason, well, we got a situation we've got to work with. But I don't know that just to solve that one problem, we'd strike from their law enforcement officers.
Mr. Chairman, if I might ask one final question.
Please.
So as I understand what you're saying, presently, law enforcement officers, if they're there in their policing capacity and they're there lawfully, they don't need an exception in order to be to the polls. Isn't that true? If they, for example, there's a shooting in the polling location, it's clearly permissible for law enforcement to go in the polling location at that point, right? They don't need this.
I would think it would be.
They don't
obvious,
need
yeah.
this exception in order to do that.
I think it would be obvious if there was a crime being committed or an emergency that they could be there.
So the question is, what does this language do?
Well, I'm trying to figure out what you think it does. But what it says to me is that there's no question that a law enforcement officer has the ability to be there.
Well,
You assumed it. This makes it clear.
Representative, I may ask your original question, though. The original question was for the purposes of not gaming the system. I would submit that it would be a contradiction if you could, one or the other. You can't have it both ways. You can't say if they're going to show up to campaign, then they shouldn't be there. I would sit there and go, this makes it clear that you can protect the citizens, and I know that that's what every Georgian wants.
Mr. Chairman, if I might respond, I think there are two separate and distinct concerns. The question about campaigning, I think the representative, the vice chairman, is correct that there is a separate statute that would prohibit that for any candidate, and that probably adequately addresses it. The concern I have is that this opens up the possibility that a law enforcement officer could be in the polling location with no law enforcement intention whatsoever, and the polling officer could do nothing about it. It's specifically a voter intimidation concern. That's the issue.
I would welcome you to drop a separate bill with that concern and bring it by the office so we can turn around and make sure that that's not the intent. Any other questions? Great. At this time, I will entertain a motion. Got a motion to pass. Second. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, like sign. The ayes have it. Representative, Lott. Chairwoman Lott, I think we're ready for you now.
Ballinger.
I'm sorry. What am I doing? Goodness gracious, y'all got me confused. Ballinger. Why did I say Lott? Thank you. I feel terrible.
It's all good.
I don't care what you call me. Mr.
I know, just as long as it's something polite.
It's good to see you, Chairwoman Tankersley. Thank you for being here.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Regardless of my name, and I did have a hard time finding my name badge in that bag that my son refers to as the bag of death. So anyway, it's warranted, I guess. I bring before you today House Bill 303. This deals with the Georgia Commission on Family Violence. I'll just kind of run through really briefly some of the changes. The real substantive changes on page 1. The changes that you see on 21 and 22 are just really cleanup. 40 and 41, we struck the specific organization Men Stopping Violence and just went with a more descriptive words rather than the specific organization Men Stopping Violence. And then the lines that are struck from 48 to 58 have to do with the initial appointees to the Georgia Commission. Obviously, that's antiquated, so it just kind of starts because we're starting the new term. And the real substance of the bill begins on page 59 whenever we're changing the term from 2 years to 3 years. So that's really the heart of the bill right there. And if anybody is serving in an ex officio capacity, if they are no longer, say they're a Superior Court judge or something like that, if they're no longer a Superior Court judge, then they obviously have to come off. That is the following lines. And then the 72 through 82 kind of clarifies how the reimbursement proceedings work. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Representative. I normally, y'all know I like to put things in a sub, but this was a little late, and I thought it was frankly very, very clean. Only question I had is, just walk us through the need to change the term from 2 to 3.
Well, it's actually at a request from the executive branch. They're fatigued, and I think that it would provide, I am one of the speaker's appointees to the Georgia Commission on Family Violence. That's why I'm bringing the bill. So it would actually provide, I think, a greater continuity for the organization. So that's why I'm personally on board with it. But it was at the request of the governor's office that the measure was brought.
Chairwoman Ballinger. Any questions from members of the committee? Wow, good job.
Yay!
Now's the time. Motion do pass. Do I hear a second? Got a second. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, like sign. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman,
Ballinger.
members of the committee. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, y'all, we got a few more bills or two that's been dropped. Some's getting a little attention. So y'all have fun with those, and we're probably going to put some more bills and subs here in the next few days or so. And with that, we're adjourned.